Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. And Dr. Spachis, an especially warm welcome to you. We do need to explain that one of our panelists, Omari Isa, has had a death in his family in Tanzania and is unable to join us this morning. Well, we were hoping that his flight from Dar to Mwanza might land on time, but I think the fact that he is not here indicates that it did not. And we are very sorry to miss a chance to speak with him, but as we all know in these times, life can go that way. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Spachis, the Secretary General of the European Business Council for Africa and the Mediterranean. Dr. Spachis has also worked as an academic and a consultant and has a very interesting perspective, both from his own perspective and of all your member organizations, sir. This topic, strengthening the business climate, is a huge topic. So we're going to do our best to be quite concrete and break it down into some of the key elements, including barriers to doing business, job creation, a reliable legal system, impact of corruption, impact of debt, governance. We do have to talk about how COVID is affecting the business climate. And that was very clear in the plenary session also, that we do have to think about the challenges that this creates, especially for investment and private sector development. I'm going to first hand over to Dr. Spachis to speak just for 4 or 5 minutes to give his perspective on some of these issues, just so that we, sir, can understand your vantage point, where you're coming from on some of these issues, and then we'll move to a conversation. So over to you, good sir, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to use your excellent platform and audience for passing on a couple of key messages that I would like to convey on behalf of the European Business Council for Africa. Let me first remind that the European Business Council for Africa, it's a non-profit organization, a European federation, and it is an advocacy institution where we are trying to advocate good practices and the good access of the private sector into business in Africa. And we do this to 2 audiences, both in Europe and also in Africa. Now, in that sense, we have been monitoring what is happening with the business climate over many, many years. Our collective experience goes very, very long ago. And it is clear that what is the solution to the potential needs of African development, we believe can be resolved only by giving more possibility to the individuals and the private companies to develop initiatives. And when it comes down to the ground, this means you need to have business climate conducive to make people, individuals, companies wish to invest. And this is quite an issue. Not everybody agrees on that part. And the business climate, some people want to make it happen under different conditions, including state control, directions by the government in the economy, local directions, and that's where we step in. So we have, first of all, analyzed what is missing. And there is a number of issues that are coming on. First of all, we need more confidence for an investor to invest his money. And confidence means some rate of return, of course, on his investment. Otherwise, why would he go? So profit is not anathema. Profit is legitimate. We need rule of law. We need security. We need infrastructure. And we need, of course, qualified persons that will run the business for the entrepreneur. You just have heard the summary of what is our position. We need, therefore, if we want to strengthen the economic development in Africa, which is something for the mutual benefit of both Africa and Europe. Let us not forget Europe is the closest continent and the traditional closest link to Africa. So we need, therefore, security, rule of law, fight against corruption, transparency, preparing professionally suitable personnel to work in industry and other businesses. And we need, most of all, the acceptance that profit is the motivating factor in these and not something to be punished or banned. Now, when the Europeans are invited to go to Africa, they are always asking, shall I find some protection? Shall I find someone who will advocate for me once I'm in an African country and I start developing my business, investing my capital, etc.? Do I have someone to rely on? This is something additional. We need to make sure that the business organizations and the business initiatives from Europe are feeling they are supported by some European authorities or state authorities, or you call it whatever you like. Then comes, of course, the question of competition. Yes, okay, you are working on improving the conditions, you are trying to reduce our risk, you are even finding some financing for our risk reduction. This is a major European initiative, by the way, how to reduce risk for enterprises in Africa. Then we are there on the ground, and then we are faced with some competition, and I will be very open, sometimes on unfair competition. They feel that several Chinese operators are not abiding by the same rules and conditions as the Europeans. When a European company based in Europe makes an offshoot in an African country, there is always the motherland that somehow has an oversight of how the European company behaves on the ground. So they cannot violate human rights, they cannot violate environmental controls, they cannot violate labor law. They have to behave in a civilized way according to what we call civilized in the Western European context. Therefore, when they go there, they are bound to follow the same rules or similar principles as those they are following in Europe. And then on the ground, there are competitors from countries which behave a little like the Wild West. They are not subjected to such controls, they are not subjected to such constraints, and they can do whatever they want in terms of maximizing profit by not respecting labor law, by not respecting unions, by not respecting environmental standards, by not respecting a number of other parameters. And this is where we are pleading for a playing field in competition in Africa. And this is the sort of discussions that we would like to see increased, both at the level of the OECD debates, where there is strong debate already underway, but also we would like to see it also on bilateral relations between the European Union and others. For example, China, Brazil, Turkey, etc. Everybody wants to go and do business in Africa, and it's legitimate, and we are not complaining that they want to do competitors. They want to be competitors. What we are complaining is that they are not bound by the same constraints as the European companies are. And this is a major issue, and this cannot be resolved only by people like us in seminars debating the importance of playing level playing field, but also we have to be supported in official positions and in official meetings through the European authorities when they meet all these other important actors on the field.
Dr. Spachis,
May I stop on this point and wait for questions?
This was perfect. And I actually so appreciate how frank you are, because I think it's very important that we talk about things like corruption and unfair competition. And if we don't do that, we are being too generic, and we have to be realistic about the challenges in our case that Nordic actors face, but also all of your members. You mentioned the rule of law, and I wanted to hear a little bit more what you think of that. And I had a specific question on that, which was, Can you think of, say, 3 things that African governments could do to make the court system, the rule of law, more trustworthy and reliable, and things that you think there's a greater than 60% chance the governments would actually follow? So I'm particularly thinking of how rule of law for contracts and this sort of thing works out for your members. What are some things that could make the court system work better and be more trustworthy?
By definition, those that are already invested in Africa are those people that have made their calculated risks, and they have some way of dealing with court delays, with let's say, some uncertainty in the court decisions, etc., or some legislation that sometimes is contradicting itself with other legislation existing in the same country. And these are realities that they are already faced with. Now, any improvement on these can only encourage them to invest more deeply and more heavily in the country, and this will be the paradigm that will incite others to go and invest as well. So I'm not saying that African countries do not have systems. They are not banana republics. They are serious people trying to do their best. But there is something else. There is some lack of coherence and lack of coordination at the moment. If you go to invest in one African country, you want to do business also with the neighboring African countries. You are not investing for a small market. You want to invest, if you are to be a serious investor, you want to invest for a bigger market, which means that then there must be possibility for your services and products to go across the local border. Then comes another country which has different technical regulations, which has different practices in applying the regulations, and they have also sometimes the, let's say, a post-colonial syndrome of protecting their own markets and their own indigenous productions, and therefore they play even technical barriers, or they have fiscal barriers, or they have tariffs. So a major element for us would be that the Africans proceed solidly between themselves in creating what has created the prosperity in Europe.
And the plenary session talked a lot about free trade, the African Free Trade Agreement. At the moment, less than 14% of trade that African countries do is with other African countries. So this goes very nicely to my next question, which you brought up, which is, once you try to trade with your neighboring country, what are the barriers? And often it's quite technical barriers, customs, paperwork, documentation. And do you feel, and do your members feel, that there are some things that European actors, Nordic and other European actors, could do to help facilitate that intra-African trade?
I mean, our approach to that is advocacy. This is our role. Great. We believe that we have to produce convincing arguments for specific proposals that we bring forward, so that European authorities and African authorities are interested to look at them, subscribe to them, and possibly start working on them. Now, don't forget that there is a huge interest, at least in Europe, which the major donor in the world in Africa. All the other donors are very, very small contributors to the African system, as you know. So the Europeans could have some sort of programs specific to encourage these bringing down of barriers, opening up of borders, bringing the free movement of people, of goods, of services, of capital. We have a huge experience on that, because that's how we have built the European prosperity in the last 60, 70 years, by bringing down barriers. And we are convinced that bringing the barriers down will have as well beneficial effects for the African economies. And therefore, we will go to a situation where Our proposals are addressed to both European Union and other similar institutions and the African Union.
I also, you talked about movement of goods, but also people, and that made me think of the restrictions on movement of people that have come about as one of the many terrible consequences of the pandemic. The COVID pandemic, which we are all trying to learn how to live with and how to manage. And I wondered what your members think of how that is affecting investment and private sector development. Have you heard anecdotally investment decisions being put on hold, sort of wait and see attitude? What is the view of some of your members on the pandemic?
Now, let me clarify. The members of the European Business Council for Africa are organizations like the Norwegian one. So the Norwegian organization has company members. So there is a feedback to us from the companies on the ground via NABA and similar organizations. And the feedback we receive is that, first of all, the impact of COVID in Africa is less pronounced than it was feared, much less pronounced, and certainly much less than Europe or Americas or India, China, etc. So we're talking about a different scale of phenomenon. Secondly, clearly, it's not a moment that they take major decisions, but it's a moment where they all review their portfolios and see their longer-term strategies with the perspective that at some moment we will have a green signal that the pandemic is now under control and we are returning to a business as usual or almost model, and they are all preparing for that moment. Meanwhile, their companies in Africa are not suffering in a devastating way from the pandemic. They are suffering much less, if at all, compared to the European corporate scenario.
And I have actually heard the same, and and who knows, the reasons of why it would have less impact is probably not for us to debate today, but I've absolutely heard the same, and I think we have to hope that the impact, for example, tourism with people, that is a very clear impact because that is people coming from Europe, which is so severely impacted to African countries. So we have to hope that sectors like that can get back on track. But in general, that's exactly the take that I have on it also. I wanted to ask a question about governance. So I had listened, our other panelist, Omari Issa, who was supposed to be able to join us. He had done a podcast a few years ago, and he talked about when he left Celtel and when he left the investment climate facility, that it was time to move on, that, he'd done 6 years in both places. It was time to let younger people step up. And he had a great line: if you build the institution right, you have nothing to fear. So I wanted to ask your view, just you personally, you don't need to speak on behalf of your member organizations now, what you would say to African presidents who've been in power for decades, and whether you think that has something to do with an effect on the business climate and the appeal for investment, or do you think it doesn't? Is that me imposing a Western framework? But in terms of identifying a successor, should someone young be able to step up? What is your frank view of that?
Obviously, we come from a context of a different political tradition. And up to a certain extent, one can understand that the first few decades of autonomous rule in some countries may lead to excesses, derailments, etc. But the experience is that normally, once someone has a political system which is authoritarian, not renewing itself, not allowing real open public dialogue, etc., the same system at the end of the day is based on a clientele, and that local clientele tries to derive revenue from business. And that revenue from business kills business at the end of the day, kills the business confidence that will allow other businessmen to go in, because they feel that if they have a dispute with a regime which does not meet our, let's say, traditions and working methods as we know them in Europe, they will end up being weak in case of a conflict, in case of a competition, in case of a litigation. They will not have any recourse to system that will give them their rights. And that inevitably kills the interest to go and invest in such countries. And you just do your own checklist and you will see the veracity of this. Just go and see and relate how the political index, let's say the democracy index in a country, relates to the economic development index. They are clearly reversely correlated. The less democracy you have, the more you frighten investors, especially foreign investors. And even the local investors, they have one thing in mind: how to take their money to another place, which is a better haven for conducting business. So I will not make a political judgment whether I like the regimes, but I do make an economic judgment that a regime that is not transparent, not competitive, not open, and not abiding by clear rules of laws, and not allowing public dialogue, this regime inevitably goes down the drain.
This was an excellent answer, and I appreciate your candor. I think it's very important for us to be frank about these sort of elephants in the room. I thought of two that when you gave your very great opening remarks, which were, of course, the challenge of corruption and the challenge of investment, whether it's from a country like China, but we don't need to single China out. It's many other countries also where the rules don't apply in quite the same way from the motherland, as you charmingly put it. And then this means that it's not a level playing field. And that brings me to a question. Because I don't want to just be negative, are there two things that you feel, what are the two things you feel your members and then their members, so your associations and the members of the associations, are enthusiastic about right now in terms of the African investment landscape, and two things that keep them up at night? So I'll end with I'll say the up at night, because I do want us to be frank about the challenges, but let's start with two things that they're excited about: opportunities, something that they feel maybe gives an opportunity to leapfrog and take a jump forward. We'll start with the positive.
Yeah, the positive is that those that go to work in Africa have confidence in the markets, and they have confidence in the demographics of the countries. Because they see that there is at the moment a small percentage of middle-income families, what we would call easily, let's say, middle classes, that can participate in the market. And they see there a huge potential that with smart moves and good policies, this percentage of middle classes can increase vastly. While in Europe, our middle classes percentages are saturated. I mean, we have problems, of course, of distribution of wealth, etc., but we're in a totally different situation in terms of existence of middle-income families and middle-income consumers. And therefore, they see a huge potential of increase in the percentage of the population that can participate in the market. And that percentage at the moment is very small, so any improvement is market opportunity.
That's one. Great. Second.
The second is that there is a young workforce available. The populations are young. So if you want to do business, you don't have only new potential consumers, but you have new potential employees, workers, collaborators, etc. So you don't face the difficulties that an entrepreneur faces in Europe in terms of finding qualified personnel. There, they just find young people able to work, willing to learn, and ready to invest themselves in a new life. And this is a dynamism that you don't always find in the older continents. That's the second thing.
So that was two great things for a cause for enthusiasm, the strength, the potential strength of the middle class and a young population that is keen to work. What are two things keeping your members up at night?
The slow progress in creating the good market conditions. For every 2 steps in the good direction, there is always a step back somewhere. So overall, there is progress, but not fast enough. So if you make an investment plan, you have a time horizon. You make your calculation for a return on investment over a number of years. So delays in developments, delays in the opening up of the markets, delays in improving the technical standards, delays in improving the rule of law, may have an impact on your time horizon. Your return on investment will be much later. And that is a major risk decision. And of course, the other obvious risk is the political instability or social instability that goes with these young democracies. If you have a next time you are there, if you have a risk of being abducted for whatever motivation or under whatever pretext, or if your workers are attacked, or if your workers are called in to chip in informal tax system for one organization or another, or for a tax collector that goes wild. These are, so the rule of law and the lack of security is what worries them most.
And the security point is an interesting one, because there has been a lot of news of coverage in the media lately of even just physical security concerns. So, for example, in Mozambique, some attacks on gas terminals and companies feeling that they need to go to private security providers, which is, so more in the model of the Congo, of Congo-Kinshasa, where that's been the case for years. And do you think, so can you say a little bit more about the sort of physical security rule of law aspect, and whether you think that who you think is ultimately responsible for that, and that is what the risks are when private companies end up outsourcing that responsibility, and because the government isn't able to manage.
It is common practice in many parts of the world to use additional security, private security for premises, for personnel, etc. So I do not think it's the result of just crazy people being extremely insecure in their psychology. I believe it reflects real risks. And there is nothing more I can say that it's a job for the government of the country in question to take care of their own backyard. I mean, it's not for me to tell them to improve their security. At the limit, it's something that Africans could exchange experiences, know-how, and maybe support across their own borders through the African Union, for example. They could develop some sort of security policy debate of how they can improve these matters in Africa. And of course, support from Europeans should be very tactful on this matter, because you can very easily be tagged as post-colonial coming back.
I absolutely agree with you, and I appreciate that nuanced answer. You had mentioned earlier, you talked about transparency, and I was thinking specifically about, because I'm sure this affects many of your members, transparency around contracts, transparency around ownership, and I wondered if you have, because I know your advocacy is such an important part of what you do, a position, a sort of an advocacy position on the issue of transparency, especially in the extractive industries, and whether you think that's part of improving the level playing field.
We are not specifically focused in one sector, so therefore I would not be volunteering to say anything on sectoral basis. We know well from press reports, from NGOs, etc., excesses that have been carried out in certain sectors, in certain countries. But at this point of time, it's not for us to pinpoint who is not doing enough work in their own country to control their own business. It's counterproductive. We know that exists, and it's not the sort of thing that I would like to record in a public debate.
It's a very good point. And I was really just curious about whether you had an advocacy position on that. And that brings me to another thing that you might have an advocacy position on more directly, which is the issue of job creation. And it was interesting in the plenary session when the foreign minister of Norway said, we were hoping for 20 million new jobs, and instead 20 million jobs have been lost over the last few months on the continent, perhaps because of COVID, and whether you have a position on job creation and skills development. I think we would clearly agree it's the crucial pillar for economic development, but if you had a position on that, sir.
Clearly, yes. And we advocate that jobs will be created, not when a few companies more will go to invest in Africa, but when the business climate will be sufficient for every African potential entrepreneur to be able and willing to start a business. And of course, allow also foreign entrepreneurs to participate in this possibility. So business climate improvement is one hand, and the other is training, vocational training, not academic education as such, which is absolutely needed, but we go one step beyond. We are not talking anymore about analphabets, etc. We are talking about people that have gone to school, that have gone through a curriculum, but the curriculum is not enough to make them employable in business. So we want employability to be integrated into their national education systems, vocational training systems. And therefore, that's our second advocacy: reinforce employability of the young generation by offering suitable vocational training opportunities in partnership with the private sector, in partnership, of course, with every business in the country, but don't do it simply in academic closed walls.
This is a great answer because I like that it's concrete and practical, and I completely agree. I'm all for strong academic training, but we have to think about what makes people employable in the workforce and vocational training. So I think that's a super advocacy position. I wondered, you spoke about African entrepreneurs and also foreign investors, but African entrepreneurs being able to set up their own business. And what are I'm thinking a little bit about the World Bank ease of doing business, their sort of list of criteria, whether even just the paperwork, the documentation, registering the company, getting the permits. What do you think are the most important aspects of being able to set up a business smoothly? What are some lessons that we can take from your members and how it's possible to set up a business in Europe, in a European country, to making it easier to do in some African countries? And I know part of that is digitalization. Do you need to go and wait in 7 different queues to get the paperwork done that you need to get the signature, etc.? But what do you see as the main issues?
The issues are the same all over the world. You need ideally a one-stop shop where you can
exactly.
go and get started. And if this is not possible, you need to go down from 15 certificates and 15 public authorities to 2 or 3 rather than 15. 7 is already too much. So we need reduction of the bureaucracy and simplification of procedures, which procedures exist for 2 reasons. One is to protect public interest, and that has to be protected. We are not denying protection to the public good, but we are observing in many places that the system of multiple authorities getting involved is a self-perpetuating bureaucratic system. The bureaucracies tend to go on. And this is also, let us not forget, the reasons of getting corruption, because the more papers you need, the more possibilities you have of being solicited for corrupt payments or facilitation monies. So the fewer you have of those, or the more automated they are, of course, the better.
But this is not specific to Africa. This is for everywhere
this
in the
is
world.
absolutely the world over. I completely agree with you. But those were some very, very good practical points. So moving from the very sort of smaller level, setting up a small business, this type of thing, I'm going to move to question much more about key decision makers, stakeholders, people who are making policy that governs the investment climate. I listened to a podcast earlier this week of the South Africa Norwegian Business Association, and an interesting theme was access to decision makers. And this was one thing that some of the panelists felt was a challenge that, just literally, and I don't mean because of COVID, I just mean in general, because of course we can meet the way you and I are meeting now. How you would advise your members if they, in some countries, find it difficult to get audience, to get access to stakeholders and key decision makers who they would like to get to know and build relationships with, whether you would have advice for them if that was difficult. And I'm not talking, I'm quoting from that podcast, from that webinar, but I'm not talking specifically about South Africa. It could be anywhere.
We have specific ideas about that, and there are two ways of approaching access to authorities in countries receiving investment. In addition to, of course, knocking their door and soliciting to meet them, we have the diplomatic circuit. Economic diplomacy is there, and the European Union in particular is now embarking on an effort to increase its contribution in economic diplomacy. And the national embassies do it all the time. And the other is professional organizations like ours. We are a European Business Council for Africa based in Europe. We would like to have serious counterpart organizations in every
on
capital.
The ground. Yeah.
On the ground, and we would like these local organizations to be detached from the political system, because we do have some countries where the local organizations, the local chambers, etc., are controlled by government or similar entities, let's say, similar actors. We want the local organizations to be seriously independent. And we can also wish that there are always clubs and groupings of European companies already in an African country, which club themselves together, and they are another landing point for someone who wants to do business in Africa. So that's how we see the approach.
Again, that's practical, and I appreciate that very much. I think that's very good advice. I wonder.
Let me add on that we were to have a Europe-Africa Business Forum, and one of the issues we were considering with African counterparts already was how to streamline and how to help create counterpart business organizations in the African countries. So it's very concrete. We want to help create counterparts in every African capital.
And did you work, does your association work, for example, with local chambers of commerce, or that would be a different sort of setup? Who would you work with now, where there isn't a counterpart that is quite organized the way yours is? Who would your interlocutors be?
Mind you, we are a European business organization. So we are not picking up one particular country, let's say Benin, and try to create a strong local organization in Benin. That we leave it to others to do. We can be interested only for a program where we will try to create in every capital an organization. Otherwise, we cannot just pick up one country and try to privilege it compared to others. We have, let's say, equal interest for all African countries.
Yeah, no, this is very interesting.
It's a principled starting point.
I feel we've talked about lots of the advocacy positions that your business association has, but I may be missing some, and I'm just going to ask a few things, whether you have a position on it or not, and you may not. One thing that comes up in terms of strengthening the business climate is the issue of debt forgiveness. And this was being talked about a lot pre-COVID, whether there should be, and now, of course, some debt burden has become really very unsustainably high. And do you think this needs to be addressed? And is there a way to address it that doesn't disadvantage nations that did exercise greater fiscal discipline?
We do have a position on debt forgiveness in relation to COVID only, not a federal one. And that can be accessed publicly. But it's very simple. Stop asking the money back for those that have, let's say, loans that they cannot pay in African countries. As simple as that. But this is not a permanent, sustainable situation. So it cannot be a practice where every now and then a country says, oh, I'm too far down the line, I cannot do anymore. And then you get your debt forgiveness, and then 10 years later, you are back, or another country is back in 5 years with the same question, and you say, oh, but because we said yes to country A, we cannot say no to country B.
Exactly.
So in principle, we cannot abide by debt forgiveness, but we let other actors, international financial institutions, play on that, how they want to support. Rather than forgiving debt, they have already systems of grants and loans. They can play their systems much, much better than we can.
And
And I have specific institutions in mind which have this, let's say, these tools in their toolkit.
Yeah, absolutely. This was very interesting. I also wondered, I understand that you don't have a sectoral focus, but I did wonder if you had any thoughts, for example, on the effects of low commodity prices, whether you feel for some of your members are talking about that, whether the sort of pressure on the oil and gas sector because of lower oil prices, and how your member associations are reacting to that. This doesn't have to be a specific oil and gas comment. Of course, there are other commodities, of course, that are hugely important for the investment climate in Africa. Any comment on the markets there?
We are not following the intricacies of how to regulate the commodity markets. And most of our members are less of a trader and more of real investors. So typically our members are investors in services, in production lines, in agricultural production, in infrastructure, etc. Typically, we don't have in our members, our membership, large numbers of those that have invested in the production of commodities.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
These are a different type of breed of companies, and we don't know them well enough.
This is fair enough. And I wondered if there was any sort of specific regional agreements that you feel you're advocating. We talked about free trade, but are there sort of regional bodies that you are aligned with? Any comment on how we can work as Nordic actors to strengthen regional trade agreements and bodies?
The only serious body that I can see working on the regional integration in Africa is the African Union. And therefore, it depends on how far they want to work with us. They want to work with the Europeans for sure. They have very close links with the European Union. They have, in principle, an open mind for working with the private sector. And the only thing I could suggest is that we go to do more of the same. I would encourage them to get in touch not only with the public institutions like European Union, but also with the private sector organizations that are interested for trade and business. And in particular, the African organizations that are still a little embryonic in their creation or not existing at all. So there is a task there
to create the institutions, the civil society organizations that will support this discussion.
I was just going to say that we have a few comments on the side of our session here, and it was interesting that someone noted that we spoke at the beginning about the effect of COVID in different sectors, and I had mentioned tourism, and someone had said that was had really stolen the confidence in continuing investment and created so much uncertainty in that sector, and particularly asking about how we could strengthen the business climate for investments in tourism going forward. And of course, I understand we're not going to be too sectoral here, but I wondered if you did have any views on that for tourism and travel around the continent, and even thinking of the airline sector for the airline, which is huge job losses.
Here the advice is very simple. Let's keep what is possible to keep alive. Let's have a survival strategy for the short term until we see better the future. So it's not the moment to do any new strategies, new investments. It's just survival and maintenance of what we have. Let's try to keep alive the infrastructures, whatever we can keep alive, so that the moment that we have the return to normality, then the system is there to restart.
A realistic viewpoint. I wanted to say that I think, although it's such a shame that we're not sitting on a stage meeting in person in Oslo now, one of the great things about this summit and our session being done virtually is the inclusion aspect of it. And so many young people from so many different African countries who are part of this summit today who would not have been able to get on a plane. I'm not talking about COVID at all, but just would not have had the wherewithal, the sort of the funds or the ability to travel. And I think it's so great that they are listening to this. And so I wondered, this comes back a little bit to the job creation and vocational training, but just in general, what your advice would be to the young people who are listening to the two of us who are not so young anymore on this call. And so in terms of education that they should go for, skills they should obtain, the sort of how they should think about, not just because of COVID and remote learning, but just in general, whether it's someone who's considering what to study or that they want to set up a business. What would your advice be to the young people who are listening to us today?
If I were to counsel a young person, I would first invite him to dream how he or she would like to be 10, 20 years from today. And that should take into account also the technology developments, the digitalization of the societies, the advance in democratization, etc. And then following this reflection of what you would like to be, then see what are the skills needed for you to reach there. Not what is the education title that you want to get, but the skills needed. And with these two advices in mind, I would tell them, get the skills you need to do your dream a few years later.
This was wonderful advice. Okay, so now we'll move away from advice to our young listeners, advice to business leaders. So when you have the perspective, the European Business Association perspective, we talked about what your members are enthusiastic about and what keeps them up at night. Then if you were speaking to a room, which we may well be, we don't know exactly who's on our panel, who's on our listening to our session, but a room full of, and we don't need to go country specific, but of young business leaders. So they've already gotten their skills, they've got their jobs, they're trying to make a go of it with all the challenges that we've talked about. What the advice would be for what they're doing and also what they need to advocate for in their countries.
The advocacy of an entrepreneur living in an African country, I would believe, should be more or less similar to the advocacy I'm making here. Create space for business, create space for healthy competition, allow level playing field, and get the country, the state, to produce infrastructure, training, vocational training, rule of law, security, etc. That would be the advocacy for them as well. Of course, there are very specific items that can come under these chapters. And this is where the young entrepreneur has to see also a little the business opportunities 10, 20 years from now, and prepare himself for that perspective. So at the moment, for everybody, just try to keep afloat,
Yes.
minimize your exposure to risk at the moment until things stabilize, and then up you are ready for your next 5 to 10 year business plan.
You spoke when I said about things keeping up at night. One thing was the slow, how things can just take time, you know, and that this is not and the sort of slow progress of good market conditions and delays, that can be a sort of risk decision. And one thing that I absolutely agree, and from my own perspective, advising investors in the area of integrity due diligence, is that you just have to have a longer term perspective. This is not a sort of short, quick in, quick out. I just don't think that's how this works, and especially now with COVID. Just a few other, if you could just sort of round up, we only have a few minutes left, on the sort of table of risks. So you talked about the sort of, that's a major risk decision, is the amount of time. What are seen as too risky, and how do we moderate the risk picture for investment in Africa and make people?
I'm losing the line. I don't know if it is me or your line.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Now,
please repeat.
Yeah, so what are the main risks that your association members are evaluating when they are making decisions about business investments? What we talked about delays, but what are the sort of what's on their list of risks that need to be evaluated and mitigated?
First of all, it's the risk of their business plan itself.
Okay.
The assessment of the market potential, and that market potential is based on an increase of the market in the local area. You don't go to invest in a mature market where there are many competitors. You go to invest in an area where you feel either there are competitors but there is market expansion, or it's a new market area and you are among the first to arrive.
Yeah, first mover.
So one risk is themselves, is their assessment of the market. The second risk is risks of related to transparency, corruption, security, rule of law, lack of governance, lack of accounting standards are seriously implemented, lack of auditing systems. So this institutional layer missing. That's the second risk. The third risk is the political risk. You have a president, you have a government, then up there is a reversal of this, a new team, new personalities, new policies. I'm not making value judgments whether the new are better or worse than the old, but it's new. So it's a new set of decision makers in the country. That's the third risk. And together with that goes the conflict risk, the political risk of conflicts. Conflicts not only with neighbors, but conflicts within the country. Tribal conflicts, religious conflicts, other political conflicts. So this is another serious risk.
No, this was an excellent list and overview, and I agree. It's no judgment about a new government coming in, but of course, if you were close to a previous administration, which in some sectors you have to be, especially in sectors like oil and gas, you have to have relationships with key stakeholders and senior ministry officials, and it is a challenge when if a new party comes in, even if you try to stay out of the politics, which I'm sure many European investors do their best to remain apolitical and removed. There's no way to avoid some political exposure. So we have just a few minutes. So I wanted to turn the floor over if you had final points that you wanted to say. We've had an interesting conversation, but the people who are listening to us, because I think you have such an interesting viewpoint for your organization. And for example, someone in the comments, I want to pass this on to you, I know you're not reading them, said that they totally subscribe to that model of local affiliate offices for strengthening the business climate between the two continents. So I think it's great that people have been inspired by the leadership role that you and your organization play. I give the floor to you. We have 2 minutes left, Dr. Spachis, and thank you.
There is excellent opportunity in Africa for the reasons we have heard from many people. Increasing market, young population, availability of labor force. There is only one advice I would like to conclude. If you are European and you want to go to Africa, you don't go for the quick kill, you go for the long term.
Long term.
And you don't do it with proxies, you go yourself there. So you cannot say, oh, I found an excellent local partner, I entrust him with everything and he does everything for me. You have to pick up your luggage, open household there, stay there and go for the long term. So you have to be a serious investor. Africa is not a place for the easy riders.
No. It is not. It is not. This was wonderful advice. And also, I think it's so great to end on that positive note, but I was thinking about when you made this comment about the Wild West and that we really don't want African countries to be treated that way. I think we can agree it's not fair and it's not healthy for strengthening the business climate going forward. So I really thank you, Dr. Spachis. I think you've been so inspirational, but also very concrete and practical and very honest, and I appreciate your candor. So was a great message. And I
may I congratulate Christy for organizing the thread of this discussion in a way that it is clear, concise, practical, efficient, and thoroughly efficient.
Well, that was kind of you to say, because I think we did have to pivot a bit on it just being the two of us. We were very sorry that Mr. Issa was not able to join. And I give you great thanks, sir, for keeping us going for this hour. And I appreciate so much everyone joining. And we just wish you were all with us in Norway today. I have to say that is a shame, but I think I love that it was inclusive and that people could join us even if we were not able to be together. But I appreciate the note of optimism that you sounded about the pandemic, sir, because I think there's so much fear and sort of panic in the media coverage. And I think it was great to sort of take a step back and say, we're going to get through this, let's ride it out, and we have better days ahead. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining the panel. And there will be another session now and another panel session later in the afternoon and several more plenaries, and there's going to be great content. And I also will just congratulate NABA. I think the content since March has been superb, and all of us as members of NABA are grateful for that. Dr. Spachis, thanks for being with us. Take care.
Thank you.
Everyone have a good day. Onward to the rest.